So good morning, everybody. I am Erin Robinson, the Executive Director of ESIP, and I want to welcome you all to this meeting highlights webinar that covers the 2019 ESIP summer meeting. Megan, maybe next slide. And so the theme of this meeting was data to action, and it aligned with our strategic goal of increasing the use and value of earth science data and information. And just looking back, we've been looking back over the last 20 years of ESIP's life, and we have had significant milestones, anything from the data citation guidelines to the work that's been going on recently in the semantic tech cluster or committee around the dataset schema.org work. And all of that has really led to the fact that ESIP as a community has made data matter, and that we're really in this exciting time now of being able to implement things that we thought about 20 years ago because of both the computational capability and the community that's been built within ESIP over the last 20 years. So this was a great meeting for us by the numbers. We had more people than we've ever had attend in person, and then we also had more content than we've ever had. And about a third of the meeting attendees were first-time attendees. So I think that that's a really healthy sign for our community that we had for every 2 people returning, we had 1 new person. And so we're hoping to continue this trend into our meetings moving forward. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Megan Carter, our community director, to talk about how we've been documenting this meeting and to be the MC for the rest of this webinar.
Thank you, Erin. So as you might expect with the impressive numbers that Erin just showed, a ton of content was generated for and during the meeting. So we're striving to preserve as much as we can, as many of you know. To aid in this, we've asked presenters to contribute their presentations and posters to the ESIP Figshare portal. You can use the URL on the bottom right of the screen here to view all posters and presentations submitted to Figshare from the summer meeting thus far. You can filter to show, for example, just the posters or just the PowerPoint slides. You can also find and access content, and this is the preferred way, through the 2019 ESIP Summer Meeting Schedule site, which is the link is shown on the bottom left. You can find the session you're interested in, click on it, and you can then view the session description, links to presentations in Figshare, a few takeaways generated by session participants, and links to the recording of the session. So I've circled some of those here. Of course, it's not too late. If you still are sitting on presentations or posters from the summer meeting, we'd love to get those into Figshare. So please do so. And if you have any questions, please contact us. So now, without any further ado, we'll have some plenary highlights, which will be given by ESIP's President Carl Benedict, Vice President Mike Daniels, and Lab Director Annie Burgess. Carl will start us off with Tuesday plenary highlights. So Carl, you can unmute.
Yes, it's better if I speak when unmuted. Yes, for the plenary highlights for day 1, we have the overview here, and if you're eventually looking at the slides, I included the direct links to the parts of the YouTube recording for the plenary. But basically in day 1, we included, of course, our welcome to the meeting and an overview with a strong focus on both highlighting the history of ESIP and its accomplishments, but then also the many contributors to ESIP's success, whether it's the leadership in our community collaboration areas, our sponsors, or other organizations that we're working with. And many of those folks are on the call today, as the highlights are really produced by the leadership across all of our areas of production. What I'm really going to focus on today are some very brief highlights for our 3 plenary presentations. And if we go to the next slide, I was happy to see Rob Casey was able to join us. He was our local partner, and his group at IRIS was our local partner for the meeting. And he kicked off our plenary presentations with a discussion of the strategies they've used and some applications of the repository and archive of what started out as a very large collection of unstructured seismic data, and the efforts they've made to try to create value from those data to make them more usable and accessible, and really ultimately increasing the impact of those data. Certainly activities that are near and dear to the heart and the strategic objectives of ESIP. So with the focus of their work, starting with the actual curation and being able to effectively exchange the data that are going into the archive, recognizing the importance and developing accessible web services based upon the content of the archive, and then also developing quality assurance capabilities around those data. But ultimately also, and this came at the end of the presentation, emphasizing also maintaining the capacity for being able to provide credit to the producers of those data that have gone into the archive. And that is key for being able to continue to support the entire value chain of data creation and production, as often the large archives, and this was a point in Rob's presentation, they end up being the ones that are often acknowledged in research projects without necessarily the necessary recognition of the original producers of those data. So their focus on being able to provide that support is critical. And the use of the archive was demonstrated through a couple of different case studies of research projects. One from Los Alamos National Lab, looking at scalable cloud-based analysis of seismic noise. The other related to the LIGO project in terms of needing to predict ground motion to be able to assess the impacts to their very sensitive instrument from seismic events globally. And in both cases, they very strongly demonstrated the value and diverse use of this large archive that's been produced. Next slide. So our next presentation was from CAI Bloomberg, who was our 2019 Raskin Scholar. And this presentation was really focusing on the power of being able to leverage disciplinary ontologies to be able to link data sets together to address some much more challenging questions. And in the context of his presentation, at a high level, being able to facilitate the linkage of data from abiotic and biotic systems. And in the specific example, his metagenomics approach, where in his presentation, he was able to walk us through establishing the linkage between a number of ontologies and allowing for the connection of data and characteristics related to those data through the use of those ontologies. Sweet and Oboe being the high-level examples, but then drilling down more deeply into some of the ontologies that are embedded within the Oboe collection. And this was a really important demonstration for being able to use ontologies to extract much more powerful insights as we talk about transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary research, where we can hopefully increase the usability of data across these disciplines. And if we move to the next slide, we have a, that's not my musical background, is it?
Yourself.
Megan, it's Sarah Graves. If you can mute Sarah. Perfect.
I was thinking I was starting to hear music in my head. And finally, our third plenary presentation on the first day was by Dr. Becca Newman, who is the 2018 Falkenberg Award winner. And her presentation was, for me, a very strong and excellent demonstration of the scientific argument that can be made and how that can be made very effectively by tapping into numerous pools of data and being able to integrate them into a coherent argument that ultimately results in policy outcome and recommendation. In particular, she focused on the dynamics of arsenic uptake into lake food webs that had, in a region that had been subject to smelting activity pollution. So this is as a result of deposition of arsenic into lakes, and looking at the dynamics of how that arsenic is actually moves around within the lake, both the physical systems of the lake and the biological network in the lakes. And you can see from the slide here, this vast array of different either data sets or also insights from physical chemistry and other more physical processes that were used and very effectively illustrated throughout the presentation to ultimately highlight characteristics of lakes that are often not focused on in analyses of the impacts of arsenic on the food webs, as much of the historic focus has been on deep cold water lakes, where based on the results of this analysis, there's a strong recommendation to be able to also focus on small shallow lakes, as those may actually be locations that are much more subject to uptake and intake of arsenic into the food web. So I found it as a really interesting and very data-rich and effective presentation of those data to make ultimately come to an impact afterwards. So in the case of all three, we have strong and different facets of the data to action in terms of the impacts of access and robust access to data, being able to link disparate data sets together through the effective use of ontologies, and then the effective use of data to create a coherent and powerful analysis and communication of those analysis results that actually impact a policy outcome. So it was an excellent morning of presentations.
Thank you very much, Carl. We'll now move to Mike, who will highlight Wednesday's plenary talks in 5 minutes or less. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thanks. It was an interesting day two series of plenary talks around increasing the use and value of earth science data, ranging from corporate topics like ESRI to institutions like the Smithsonian, to state government, and then just raw university research. So I didn't have time, or I didn't think about going into the YouTube video to highlight the various sections, but the main video is there if you want to look at it. Maybe we can add those, or I can add those times later. So the first one was by Adam Manser of the Smithsonian Institution. He talked about the size of the Smithsonian, 28 million visitors per year, and then really focused on the objects that are managed by the Smithsonian, 155 million of them. The vast majority of them are biology and paleobiology objects, but about 500,000 of them are mineral objects, including rocks, gems, meteorites. And so the Smithsonian has these two primary goals: to educate the public and then to support research. And the way they measure their success in meeting those goals, especially on research, is the number of loans of the objects that they give out, and then the use of specimens in publications. Adam showed the old metadata records, which are handwritten, very, very brief notes on cards, often not including detailed information about the location that these samples were acquired in. And so it's a challenging effort to bring especially the older samples into the modern discoverability mode that we use today. But since 2015, they've been using IGSNs for this, so the metadata is improving. Interestingly, they use the Geo Deep Dive tool to mine publications for their specimens, and that led to an average of about 15 to 30 publications per year on the mineral side. And so I think during the question and answer session, Adam was educated and also excited to learn about new ways to link these objects to things like ontologies and linked data to increase their discoverability and use. So overall, it was a good talk. We have a picture of his the humble rock, I think he called it, up in the upper right corner. The simple rock is what he called it. Sorry. Okay, next. And then Don Wright gave a talk. We were informed at the very beginning of the talk that Don has a new book out, and several copies of that book were given out for the members, about 150 of them, I believe. The new book is entitled GIS for Science, and so you can look that up separately. She had sort of a Star Wars theme in her talk, and she channeled Yoda in saying that the ease of use of data leads to more exposure leads to more adoption. And so she talked about the various methods that Esri is using to increase exposure and therefore adoption. And she talked about the viewers we're probably mostly familiar with for things like Landsat data. And then they have something a little more capable called an Explorer that allows you to do some simple analysis, but also compare imagery from various sources. They have templates that allow people to build on prior work, so people can create templates and then use them as a starting point for prior work, and then dashboards kind of put all of this together in one big display that's highly configurable. Then Don talked a little bit about the Esri Living Atlas and showed a live example of using EarthCube data in the Living Atlas. One thing, she showed so many examples of various data use that Esri has. I can't possibly cover them in this talk, so I'd recommend taking a look at the presentation. But it ranged everything from the water quality in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria to burn scars and its effect on regrowth of vegetation, and it was just really an amazing breadth of data that Esri tools are used with. She mentioned on the last part of her talk about the fact that they're using responsive design to allow their apps to work across various platforms and improve the user experience, no matter if you're on a phone or a tablet or a desktop computer. And then talked about how the FAIR theme will there's talk about it becoming fairer by adding the ethical and revisable constructs to that topic. Okay, next we had the talk by Judy Tweet of University of Washington. This was a research talk. She has a focus on building trust in public science and wondering how to really get people to focus on climate change and not just kind of see it as a problem that just can't be solved. And so her research centered around this notion that when people look at a plot of data, they kind of go numb, and they really can't appreciate the change of these data over time if you just look at the plot in an effective way, unless you're a scientist. And so she had two methods of increasing data informed action. One was to try to spark emotions to process environmental information, and then also link this environmental data with actual impacts on people. So it was a really cool talk, and she showed her creative solution, which was to take the time series data from sea ice extent and plot it, and then make a musical score out of it. So the left hand would sort of have the seasonal rhythms of the Earth, and then the right hand would have the sea ice extent, 1 point measurement per month of the sea ice extent. And so this pianist played this for us. It was about a 3-minute video. Really gave you a sense of you really did get the sense of how over time things have changed. And so it's a really powerful illustration, and I'd recommend people look at that link at the very bottom to actually listen to this video, this recording. And then for the second part, she asked about what are your personal associations with Arctic sea ice loss, to try to bring sort of a human connection to these impacts. And another recording that she would use were actual stories from people living in the Arctic who are seeing the changes firsthand. So bringing sound and sonification and music to these data was a really interesting method for increasing the impact of what's going on with our planet. And then finally, we had Jennifer Hennessy from the Washington State government. She relayed an anecdote, a story of going to a high school reunion and people saying, you know, typically like they do, what they do for work. And somebody said, oh, I do science. And the other person said, oh, science. Oh, gosh, that's got to be so boring. And so she reminded everybody about the importance of saying, you know, yes, this is the science I do, but here's the human impact. So, for example, if you're a cancer researcher, you know, you specifically say that. So I help people try to understand the cancer and its spread. And so she talked about the Washington way for Washington State, and using innovation, science, and collaboration to solve some of these problems. She went over some of the data types related to climate that the state is involved with, including snowpack and water data, hydrology and geological data, weather and atmospheric data, and then climate information. She mentioned that the Washington State governor is very proactive about instituting policies that are aimed at reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And Jennifer's particular focus was on oceans. There's an ocean warming phenomenon known as the blob in the northwest part of our country, on the ocean side, and it's a 2 to 4 degree warmer temperature, which triggers harmful algal blooms and has led to fishery closures. And Jennifer mentioned that Washington is the #1 producer of farmed clam and oysters. You didn't know that. And then they're also trying to work with an organization called the Northwest Association of Networked Ocean Observing System to develop forecasting, ocean acidification forecasting models. And so the real overall goal is for the decision makers and general public to learn more about the value of and use of observational data such as this. And that was her primary focus.
Thank you very much, Mike. Next up, we have Annie.
Right, Megan, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, so this is the Thursday morning lab plenary session, and we started the plenary by me giving a brief introduction of the ESIP lab, but then we switched over to the most recently funded lab projects giving a presentation. So you see their names there on the left. What I'd really encourage people to do is, if you'd like to know more about these specific projects, to watch their talks. I just created a bit.ly at Lab Plenary 19, or go to the esipfed.org website and go to esipfed.org/lab, and you could find out more about these projects. But I think overall, what it showed was that with a small amount of funding, in-kind support from their own institutions, and then ingenuity in using this kind of scrappier version of technology development, that a lot can be accomplished over a short period of time. And I really heard from all of the presenters that by having the platform of the summer meeting, they were able to receive further feedback on their projects and have really rich conversations outside of the plenary about what they were developing and next steps. After our lab funded speakers presented, we brought 2 additional speakers in. First was James Bednar from Anaconda, and then next Kelsey Jordahl from Planet. James started out and really is a Python evangelist, and was sharing with the ESIP community mostly about the HoloViz tools, but the kind of a vast array of Python packages that are used broadly within the sciences, but HoloViz is kind of their new-ish kind of combination of a lot of these previously disparate packages kind of put together to create a really powerful data visualization library. So I was really happy to have him kind of presenting and be introduced. That was his first ESIP meeting. And so it's great to have people from the Python community come in to our community, or come into the ESIP community. Next was Kelsey, and Kelsey is the data pipeline manager at Planet. Most of you know probably what Planet is, but they have the largest constellation of small sats today. And his talk was about Planet data applications and interoperability. He kind of spoke about Planet's general just about the company, about what they have, and then a bit about how they work towards being interoperable in the kind of earth science data landscape. So again, it was his first ESIP meeting. It was great to have him and have someone kind of from the private sector satellite imaging space to ESIP. I really hope that we can get more of those folks to our meeting in the future. But overall, I think it was a good morning of showing much more on the technical side of example applications that are being developed in the lab, and then things that are happening in the kind of public technical earth science space for our invited speakers. So let's go to the next slide. So that was Thursday morning, and then I'm just going to touch on mostly Friday morning related to the Funding Friday event. So Funding Friday is our annual mini grant competition that happens Friday morning of the meeting. Friday morning did kick off with two plenary speakers, and again, I'd encourage you to check out their talks on YouTube. But today I'm just going to mostly focus on Funding Friday. We had a fantastic turnout of posters. There was about 20 total posters that we had from both ESIP members and students and teachers. You could see the posters on the left that were awarded. The red tickets were student posters, and the blue little tags are member posters. Quick highlight, they will be up on the ESIP wiki if you want to check them out further. But Funding Friday, each person had 1 minute to pitch their idea, and then the folks that showed up in the morning walked around and heard each of those pitches, and then everyone had a chance to vote for 3 of their favorite posters. So again, the posters will be up on the ESIP wiki, and then each of the teams will present at the winter meeting about what they were able to accomplish over the past 6 months. But I thought it was another wonderful success, and it was really great to see the energy in the room on Friday morning. That's it, Megan.
Thank you, Annie. All right, so next up we have the breakout session highlights, and this will be the meat of the webinar today. There will be a series of 2-minute lightning talks. We're going to move very quickly because there are a lot of them, so strict time will be kept to keep us moving forward. So speakers, if you hear a very pleasant sounding chime, that means your time is up for that report out. I've asked each presenter to provide information on how to learn more and how to get involved, so these are by no means exhaustive report outs. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll address them as time allows. So to kick us off, we have Tyler Stevens talking about bridging the gap between discovery and use.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thanks. So the session that myself and Anna Milan co-chair was bridging the gap between discovery and use, data and tools. And in this session, myself, Anna Milan, and also Matt Jones gave a talk. So the kind of theme and discussion of all of these talks was basically talking about the increase in value of earth science data and having these different tools and services that can utilize the data. Some of the common themes that were discussed in some of the presentations were, if you look at the current way of search, order, and download, that paradigm is quickly changing. So there's a lot of users who want to start getting to the science, start working with the data more quickly and easily. And currently in some areas there's a gap between the data and the tool and service that you can use or that is known to work with that data. So there needs to be a tighter, grasp between the data and the service. So having a knowledge about a data and then a tool or service that works with that data can be very helpful. And there are also a lot of users who want to do everything online, everything in the cloud. So users don't want to have to download stuff. So they want to do all their analysis online without having to download anything. So as I mentioned, we had 3 talks. So I talked about some of the work that NASA is doing on EOS DIS with developing this tool match to match data to appropriate tools and services that can be discovered and used for NASA data. Anna Milan talked about NOAA One Stop and how they're working to improve their metadata about all our data collections and also their tools. And then finally, Matt talked about this wholetail platform is basically involved, and this is through a, I believe, Data One NSF focus project to basically bridge that gap. I'm sorry, basically to have this online platform for reproducible research. And that's all I have. And if you want to learn more, we talk about some of this stuff at the ESIP documentation cluster. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Moving on to Jessica Hausman, who's actually going to get 2 reports out. The first is on data citations, what makes a good citation. And Jessica, just so you know, I'll do the 2 minutes for this one, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Okay, thanks. So one session we had basically what makes a good citation. We have multiple data repositories that are providing recommendations on citations, and also using different ways of, not different ways, but are we all providing the same information when we register for our persistence identifiers? Typically, we've been using mostly DOIs for that. And also opening it up to the larger group of people, other repositories and other scientists trying to figure out like exactly how am I citing my data? What information do I need to put out there so that we can make the data not only help with the reproducibility, but also provide credit to the creators, make sure that there's a provide more provenance information in there. But this system has been built on publications, which are very static. And so we have heterogeneous systems that are from, in situ measurements to workflows to satellites. So the image that we have there's this program by Oceans Network Canada that has this heterogeneous measurement system in the oceans. And this is the workflow and how they figure out when they change a version and to get a new DOI. So you can see there's multiple pieces that go into this because data is typically always expanding, depending on the type of data it is, as you add more as the time flow continues. So you can't necessarily add a DOI and expect it to be the exactly same thing as if you get it from today versus if you accessed it, a year from now or even a year before. So citation information is important. It is useful to know for, I think, people. Okay. But we do have a research object citation cluster if you want to know more, and it's the 3rd Thursdays. And then the other one was on metrics. So that's the next slide. So basically, how do you capture and track research metrics for different types of research objects? There's the manual way, which is very labor intensive, but you get a lot of information with it, but it's not feasible really for most repositories to keep that. So we try to come up with automated ways to do it. Of course, you don't get the full richness. You might miss some metrics because we haven't really, doing citations has really been coming around like maybe the last, 4 or 5, 6 years. And it's so the paradigm really hasn't been fully adopted by the research community. So to get anything before you put a DOI on an object, it's difficult to do. So Data One has this make data count. So you can actually feed additional information into make data count so that you can grab the metrics from there. So now you can basically help expose the information to other interested groups, whether that be the repositories where they need to report metrics out to their sponsors or to the researchers so they can say this is the type of impact my research has had. Even though I don't necessarily write the papers, I collect the data and this is the impact it's had on the community. And trying to provide other tools. There's Geo Deep Dive. PODAC has actually developed an API on gathering metrics as well. And that's all I have. So if you want to have any more questions, you can either come to the research objects cluster, or there's also the data stewardship group as well.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was perfect timing. So next we'll move on to Heather Brown, who will be talking about how to build your data groups for optimal discovery.
Hi, this is Heather. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so this was a interactive session with Anna, Milan, and myself. We were trying to experiment with ways to determine the best level of aggregation to optimize discovery, access, interoperability, and citability, kind of what Tyler and Jessica have already talked about. But in a more specific, getting ahead of how even a scientist or data provider sets up their data, and how we can give them guidance ahead of time. So we were the group that had little flyers around that said, are you aggravated with your aggregation? That had a Slido request. And so we got a few back, trying to experiment with getting kind of feedback from various users in the ESIP community on how they actually are setting up their aggregations for discovery, access, and all the like. But we use that data, and also an experiment within our session with the people that got to attend, an experiment with doing another Slido on how people looking at the same exact thing can have a different perception. It just depends on balancing out what you're looking for, what you need, and so forth. So we also broke out into individual groups with different data types. We had 4 different groups that came up with questions to ask a given scientist or data provider to help effectively come up with the best way to aggregate their data. Turned out that actually we had very similar questions and results from each of those individual groups. But the given takeaways were that it's more than science, and it's actually kind of a bit of an art form to balance all the science needs, IT requirements, and the user needs. But that said, there was a definite interest in creating guidance based on those questions that we found that were similar, and that the best resulting level of aggregation tends to vary by basically the community that is looking at it or looking for it, and the catalogs that use it. So based on, are you a scientist, or are you a general public, or are you a policymaker? So that kind of showed up as something, maybe we can gear towards making specific questions for each of those types. But it will vary depending on the community. This came out of one of the sessions at the end of ESIP in the winter session in last summer. So we're hoping to continue this discussion in the ESIP data management cluster.
Thank you very much, Heather.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on next to Ted Haberman, who is first going to talk about the FAIR metadata session.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, this is a session that was put together by Matt Jones and Margaret O'Brien and I, and we're interested, there's a lot of work has been done thinking about what, guidance for what FAIR data is. And what we're trying to do is put together some guidance for what FAIR metadata might be, or what fields, or specific guidance, what specific fields or concepts might exist in metadata records to help facilitate the FAIR principles: findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. We're currently starting with 3 different metadata dialects: EML, ISO 191, whatever, and DataCite. And we're trying to use the ESIP community as a sounding board and as a partner in creating a set of this set of fields and guidance. And there's a Git repository. The links are here on the slide, where you can add suggestions or comments or questions about what we've got, and what fields we're using for each category. And so this will be an area where the documentation cluster will be developing, and probably along with the research object citation cluster, developing this guidance. The bottom line on this is we need you and we need your input, and please help out.
Thank you, Ted. So Ted, you're up next again also to talk about metadata evaluation tools and results.
So there's a lot of work that's going on in the general category of metadata evaluation over recent years, and we were interested in this session on how repositories are using metadata evaluation for different purposes for serving their clients or their users. They're both their providers and their data users. So the first one was Matt Jones talking about the NSF Arctic Data Center. He showed the metadata quality engine tool that was developed by a project that we worked on for NSF. It's a tool that can be used in multiple dialects, and it's the tool that we'll be using for EML and for ISO and hopefully for DataCite. Matt looked at almost 700,000 records in EML and ISO, and the results are in the first little plot on the right. This is these completeness as a function of time, and we can see findable and accessible are above interoperable and reusable, but they're all sort of increasing over time. This is a global average, which makes it look good. If you look in detail, there's a lot of variation. Margaret O'Brien then talked about the EDI metadata congruence checker, and this is a checker that has been evolved over a long period of time. Congruence is an interesting thing that they do where they have data packages that include data and metadata, so they can actually use the metadata to try and read the data and identify problems or mismatches or incongruence between the metadata and the data. Margaret has done a lot of work, and other members of LTER originally and now EDI, to work with the community to design these tests and try to encourage buy-in. The plot on the bottom on the right shows the rate of warnings as a function of time since 2013, and hopefully you would agree with me there's a decrease. Danielle Lohenberg talked about some work that we've been doing with Dryad. So in this case, in the two other cases, these are repositories working with users. In the final case, the Dryad case, the original Dryad metadata does not have affiliation information. So we're trying to use DOIs to search Crossref and PLOS and other sources to find affiliations. And then we're trying to read those affiliation strings and standardize them using the research organization repository, or RORs.
Thank you very much, Ted. I'm sorry.
That's really fun.
Thank you. All right, so moving on, we have Doug Fills, who's going to give us a few slides on the various schema.org activities at the ESIP summer meeting.
Hello, everyone. This is Doug. So yes, we had quite a representation for some of the work that's going on in the schema.org community at the ESIP meeting. And so there's 3 slides I'm going to be presenting here. And the first of these is one that Adam and I put together. In this particular session, what we were really looking at is a lot of work has been going on in the EarthCube community, and we've been transferring a lot of that into the ESIP community in terms of indexing data sets described by schema.org. And so that's been very exciting there. But one of the things that we encountered was that there are a lot of data resources that are not simple data sets that can be described as individual units, right? So we have groups like IRIS and CORDS and others who are expressing a lot of their data, big corpuses of data that are queried through APIs. And really what this session was about and what this work is about is trying to see, can we index and make discoverable and searchable in the same manner that we deal with these individual data sets? Can we do that for data exposed through services? And so that was, we had some really nice contributions by Adrian Burton from the Australian Research Data Commons and Alistair Ritchie with the ELFI and SELFI groups. And so that's really what this session was about. Out of this spun up the schema.org cluster. So that's going to be starting soon. And I think that will be a key way to get in touch with us, both in terms of the work that we're doing in this particular session for data services, but also the next two that I'm going to talk about as well. So the next one was a session that was put, actually, I think, did we skip one, Megan? Megan, did we, yeah, was there one in between there on the spatial? Thank you, there we go. So there was another session then that was put together mostly by Chuck Vardaman and Adam Shepard that was dealing with representation of spatial and temporal information for in the schema.org data set. So this was another kind of sticking point that we encountered when we were doing this work, was that when you're describing data sets using schema.org, there's a very limited capacity for dealing with spatial data. And then when you try to expand on that, there's multiple ways you can go. GeoJSON, Wicket, you can utilize the schema.org patterns themselves. And so I think one of the key things that Chuck in particular is focusing on, both in terms of its relationship to the drone cluster, but also it will become relevant to the schema.org cluster, is, what are the guidances that we can provide to the community in terms of the representation of spatial information in these data graphs that make it easier for people to come along and index them and then leverage that kind of spatial information. So that was really kind of the key thing that was going on in that regard. Similar to that spatial issue, there's also the representation of time in these data graphs as well. How do we do this? Well, there's a lot of vocabularies that are available to us. There's the very powerful OWL time vocabulary that the W3C has put together. There's the wonderful work for geologic time that Simon Cox and others have contributed to in that. And so the other thing that we discussed in this meeting was, how do we represent not only spatial information, but temporal information in that environment as well, and including geologic time, including things like sensors that may be continuing to monitor into the, from a past point to now. So those were kind of the two key things. And again, just like in the previous one of the key things or things I would advocate is a lot of this discussion will take place in that schema.org cluster. And I should also mention there's a Schemaorg channel on the Slack. That would be a very good place to find all the people that were involved in this. And so if we move on to the third one that I get to talk about. Thank you. So Matt Jones and Dave Viglis put together the third session that I'm going to talk about. And this is a really, really good session if people are interested in getting started with this. So Dave did a wonderful job. It was one of the best presentations I've seen on explaining the relationship of these schema.org data packages to kind of the traditional metadata approaches that people have taken with describing data sets, the way this is integrated into the web architecture. And just is a wonderful presentation. It's available on Figshare and there in the reference. And you can also find Dave on the Slack channel, and I provided contact information for Matt and Dave here as well. These were some of the kind of the highlights that came out of that session in terms of just preferring JSON LD, following web practices, structured metadata, using these kind of rich resources when you need to, but trying to make sure we establish on the core vocabularies, the common vocabularies that groups like the Google Dataset Search and others will be using. So it was a really nice presentation as an introduction to this concept of how to describe data sets for, with these approaches and the connection to some of the existing elements in the community. And again, I think I would just highlight that for all three of these sessions, when this schema.org cluster gets spun up, I'm sure all the announcements will go out through the standard ESIP channels. We would love to see your engagement with that, especially groups that are, data service providers, facilities, consumers, researchers, and maybe wondering, can we express how we want to do our searches through these things. One of the other things that's coming out of this is we're looking at leveraging some of the W3C shackle shapecraft mechanisms for doing validation in these environments. And so really, it was just a really fun and exciting 3 sessions. And there was 2 others that were associated with this sequence as well, which I'm sure we'll hear reports out on. So thank you very much and join the cluster.
Thank you very much, Doug. Moving on to Ethan Davis, who's going to talk about the Netcdf CF workshop.
Hi, yes. The CF community has been holding these annual meetings for annual-ish workshops for a number of years. This was the first one we held at ESIP, and it was a full-day workshop that we broke across 2 days and 4 sessions. Anyway, for those not familiar, CF is a community-developed metadata convention for storing and describing Earth system science data in the Netcdf binary data format. It works to promote the processing and sharing of data by capturing geolocation information and describing what the data in each variable represents: units, spatial and temporal properties, and just other descriptions of the physical quantities. Basically, we ended up discussing, and this was as an ongoing issue, well, we discussed a number of issues and then reviewed some of the proposals for updating and enhancing the current CF specification document. One of the bigger issues had to do with the CF governance and the process used to advance these fixes and the and changes to the specification. Basically, we've been moving for a while from an old tracking system and an email list to GitHub, and then also automating some of that infrastructure support for the system, kind of continuous integration, automatic builds of the documents and such. That's mostly complete, but we're still working. Whoops, sorry, it looks like my mute just popped on there for a second. Anyway, hopefully this will simplify things, and more community members will have an easier time actually getting engaged and helping CF move forward. There we slide lists a few of the different proposed enhancements that were discussed. And this geometries is a polylines, polygon kind of thing, and then groups is a hierarchical structure. Those have both been approved and will be in the next CF release, CF 1.8. The others are at various stages of development. Satellite swaths probably is closest to being approved next, and then linked data comes out of the OGC, some effort by a group in the OGC as well, and I think a number of people have been involved in some uncertainty discussions, and there's a proposal for supporting some uncertainty, capturing some uncertainty information in Netcdf files. So those are kind of where we are.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, that went way over. I missed the tone. Sorry.
It's okay. Next up, Joe Flasher will talk about cloud data optimization and emerging best practices.
Yep, thank you. So hi, everyone. So I'm going to be actually trying to summarize. This is actually 2 sessions. So we did a first session where we had a number of presentations, and then we had a second session that was more of an open workshop. So I'm just trying to put together a few bullet points for about 3 hours and a whole lot of discussion. So if anyone disagrees with anything I have to say here, feel free to reach out to me privately and don't yell at me on this call. Thank you. So just a couple of highlights I wanted to pull out. I think one of the things that was very interesting is we kept focusing on things like cloud optimized data sets. Like a lot of people are moving their processing and data sets to the cloud, so we want to make sure everyone's doing this in the best way possible. But somebody had a good point that basically there's a lot of things that we were talking about that weren't actually specific to the cloud, and they were things that would benefit anyone using the data anywhere, right? Whether it be in the cloud or locally. And so there's this idea that was surfaced that this is basically moving to the cloud is an opportunity to reevaluate a lot of your technical decisions, but it's not necessarily only that it's helpful in the cloud. So this is just sort of a more of a call out that I thought this is a very interesting sort of thing to note here. But for better or worse, a lot of these discussions are happening under the banner of moving to the cloud. So we're having them in these types of sessions. So one of the things that that I brought up, and so this is me on my soapbox, so I'm including it here, is I think one of the things that I see is that it's unclear who will own the cloud optimized data sets. There seems to be differing opinions about how useful these are across different agencies. And people will want to work with cloud optimized data sets if they're working in the cloud, which a number of groups increasingly are. And so if the host agencies aren't making the data available in cloud optimized formats themselves, then some other group is likely going to make the data available in a cloud optimized way. And if that's the case, you might have duplication of data, which leads to all sorts of issues around provenance and things like that. So just sort of a call out, I think it's a very interesting problem to think through of who will own these cloud optimized data sets moving forward into the future. And then the last thing I'll say here is just there's a lot of focus on data sets, but I think we also need to keep in mind tooling and services and education when thinking about the cloud piece as well. Okay, this is me as well. So another piece of the cloud in another session that we talked about was related to analytics and visualization around sustainability data. So this was just one session, and we had less speakers, so it was more of a traditional sort of breakout session. So just a few things I wanted to bring up here. One is it's been interesting for me to watch. I work at Amazon Web Services, so I see a lot of people talking about the cloud things. But it's interesting to me to see in this space groups moving past sort of prototypes or toy examples, and I don't mean this in any pejorative sense, and moving into things that you could consider more of production level systems. And so Synergize spoke about their Blue Dot Water Observatory, which I think is very interesting, but it basically shows you the scale at which groups can operate at. They're monitoring global water bodies all over the world for sort of water level changes, and they're doing this for a few dollars a month, right? They're depending on a whole lot of other infrastructure and data that's made available, but that's not their cost, right? So they're able to leverage all of the existing data and services and pay for just the piece that they need to, and so they're able to do this work for just a few dollars a month, which is fantastic. Another interesting thing I wanted to call out is we say cloud, and I think a lot of people think of like high network connectivity environments. I know a lot of us work in places where that's not necessarily the case, or we want to do projects where that's not necessarily the case. The demonstration that Element 84 gave around their disaster response tooling that actually runs on devices that work in offline environments was very interesting, because it allows you to take everything that you're doing in the cloud and also run it sort of locally on a device that you can ship in or out of a country or wherever you want to take it with you. So it was pretty cool to see these sorts of tools working in non-traditional cloud environments. And then I think we had an interesting talk showing off the need to make sure that these tools and algorithms that we're building work for everyone. And there's a human component here, but also a geospatial context. If you train models over one part of the world, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll work in a different part of the world. So just trying to keep that in mind and making sure that it works for everyone. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Next up, we'll hear from Renee Brown about the Enviro Sensing Cluster session at the summer meeting.
Thanks, Megan. So this was a session that was sponsored by the Enviro Sensing Cluster that I co-chair with Scotty Strachan. We're a community that brings together scientists, information managers, and technologists interested in situ environmental sensing for scientific research and management. In our session, we had a series of 5 talks. First was Joseph Bell from USGS, who was our invited keynote, and he talked about the next generation water observing system. Then we had 2 talks, paired talks from folks in Montana talking about sensors and LoRa and snowy alpine environments. I spoke about data management and other challenges at the McMurdo Dry Valley's LTER. And then we ended with our student fellow, Connor Scully Allison, who talked to us about data visualization tools. And so some themes that were consistent across most of the talks was a need to visualize data and to have visualization dashboards for sensor data. A couple of talks also highlighted the emerging technology for telemetry. And then we sort of ended with an open discussion about other directions that we want to take this group. And so the need for sensor metadata and raw data archival and how to deal with that. These are some of the things that we'll be focusing on in the coming year. And so I put a link in the bottom right to our website, and we would love for you to join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee. Next, we'll hear from ESIP Community Fellow Ben Roberts-Pirrell about multi-sensor data integration for cryosphere and hydrosphere monitoring.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, so this session was a little bit of a departure from a lot of the other sessions. There are more domain scientists in this session, but as this is a field that I work in, there are a lot of interesting scaling issues that are starting to be addressed by integration of multiple data sets. So like environmental sensing data and remote sensing data. So we heard from a number of different scientists as well as practitioners. That was one of my other objectives in this session, was to try to expand the scope of attendance at ESIP. So there were a couple people who this was their first meeting, and somebody from the Snowtel network. And so, yeah, this issue of scaling and working across different resolutions and trying to make up for shortcomings of different data sets by integrating additional data sets was something that came across through most of the speakers. And then we also talked a little bit about a trade-off between research grade systems, which I think is what we usually hear about in most sessions at ESIP, and operational systems like the Snowtel network, which was originally set up for water managers in the Western United States. We also talked about some of these technologies that are germane to a lot of discussions at ESIP, so drones, some other uses of LiDAR, and things that are being used for filling some of these gaps in our knowledge of the cryosphere. That included a talk by Eric Sproles, who Annie mentioned was a ESIP lab funding recipient this last funding cycle. And then we heard a talk from Ruth Durr talking about the Arctic Data Committee and kind of semantics of cryospheric data. And so I think, like a lot of other sessions, there was some limitations and things that can be improved, particularly when we're talking about trying to integrate data sets for better monitoring of the cryosphere. And that's it.
Thank you, Ben. Next, we'll have Jensen Sun talking about advanced geospatial CI for deep learning. Jensen, are you able to unmute yourself?
Hi, sorry. We talked about the current landscape of the cyber infrastructure that people are using right now to do their deep learning research in geoscience. And as we talked that that there is a lot of science activities that can be done by the deep learning in future. So we gathered several cases about earthquake prediction and their volcanoes and something like that. And we figured out that the most missing part in mining the biggest data is GPU. And a lot of people are having them on the cloud, but it's very difficult for them to combine, make the data available to all these devices. So so takeaways is like the environment for deep learning is mostly hybrid of public and private resources, and the pool management is very expensive, and also the deep learning will cost a lot of time and will take a lot of effort to train the models, and also the replicability is increases in deep learning. So the models is not universal. It's just in that case, and it will have a lot of issues if you want to use it on the stranger data set. And we developed the GeoWeaver to address all those issues, and we have already applied it in agriculture crop mapping. And the results is very impressive in North Dakota and Nebraska. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Jensen. I appreciate you sticking to the 2 minutes. Moving on now, we'll have, going too fast, we'll have Gastel, who will be talking about a metadata database built on usage patterns in the LTER network.
Actually, I think it's going to be me, Margaret.
Excuse me.
Unless Gastel's here and she wants to do it.
Apologies.
Okay.
No, Margaret will do it.
Oh, no, go ahead, Gastel.
Nope, Margaret's doing it.
Margaret, go
ahead.
I don't have visual.
Be quiet. There goes 30 seconds. Okay, this was a two-part session, and both parts are concerned with ecological metadata language, or EML. These two parts are related, but they are entirely separate projects. So first of all, a group introduced a back-end metadata database that's in Postgres, and it's being developed in the LTER network. But it would be useful to anybody managing data for ecosystem level research. Typically, those kind of site-based research groups tend to each develop their own backend systems individually and ad hoc, and this sort of a project lets them leverage each other's work much more effectively. So the database is being worked on by 5 LTER sites and is now in its 3rd generation. And a small group led by Gastel is hardening the model and associated code. And there's a GitHub link to that project. The second part of the session was focused on a project of the Environmental Data Initiative, or EDI, which is the data repository that LTER uses. EDI writes scripts and software that create and use EML, and any of you who've looked at that spec know that it's really flexible and extensible, and sometimes that can complicate writing code. So EDI would like to identify a constrained profile of EML which would streamline the scripts and software, but this would not be tied to any specific backend storage system. So what where we're starting off is to look at EML, and we see there that the creators are converging on a set of elements, and so de facto kind of a profile is starting to emerge. So in the session, we introduced the idea of a profile for EML to start the discussion, and we continued with a poster that showed the patterns of usage that we've seen so far. There is no GitHub repository yet for this project. Feel free to contact me or anybody at EDI. Now, these two projects, I said earlier, they're related, and one of the ways you could say they're related is that a backend system like this LTER core metabase could map to the EML profile through its views, where the views would decouple the outward-facing appearance from the back-end implementation. Oh, perfect! Okay, bye.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Next up, we have Cynthia Hall, who will be talking about data pathfinders at earthdata.nasa.gov.
This session that we had focused on new content that's being developed for the earthdata.nasa.gov site, content that will help users better access and discover the NASA's Earth science data. As we all know, NASA has petabytes worth of data that can aid researchers and decision makers, but this data is not always easily findable or accessible. So we have developed a series of data pathfinders that provide background information on the different types of data that are available for a specific theme. They also provide direct access to commonly used data sets. Obviously, we cannot provide an exhaustive list of data, so we worked with the community to determine what data they commonly use for a given measurement, and then made links to those most commonly used ones. The data pathfinders also provide information on NASA resources and tools for exploring or analyzing the data. And so in our session, our attendees reviewed the pathfinders and provided feedback that we could then integrate and hopefully make more usable by a novice data user. Currently, we have 3 pathfinders developed, one on wildfires, one on health and air quality. These have both been reviewed and are or will be published on the site this week. We have an agriculture and water resources pathfinder that is under subject matter review. And lastly, we are developing ones on water quality, and then one on disasters, which will include information on flooding, cyclonic storms, and extreme heat. And so if anyone has any question about those or where to go to access those on the website, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, Kelly Olds, who will be talking about the Educator Workshop.
Hi, everyone. And thanks, Megan. This year was the 11th session that we've had, having the Education Committee hosting an educator workshop through ESIP. And during this session, we focused on 3 different explorations. We started off with doing some Menti questions to kind of understand where the participants were coming from. And most of the participants were teachers from the Tacoma, Seattle area, and then a few community members also joined us, which was totally awesome to have them there. And so then we had a quick warm-up session, and that was the GOES-R series web apps, looking at how to combine channels from the GOES 16 and 17. Then the majority of the session focused on the Explore Atlantic Storms Jupyter Notebook. And so we started from the very beginning. We used Google Collaboratory because it worked. And it was a very easy way for the teachers kind of go through and click on the GitHub repository and then get into Collaboratory and then go back and start over if they needed to. So a lot of the teachers, while they had a lot high self-efficacy in technology, very few had any coding experience. And so this was really eye-opening. And of all the teachers, only 1 had a coding background. The rest were earth science teachers. So this is an audience that we've been trying to reach. And it's really exciting to see that people are willing to at least try this. And then we wrapped up with a session looking at SWAV, exploring the many data sets that are available. And Ilya Zaslavsky led that session, and we were supported by Sean Gordon and Keith Mall. As a side note, Mimi Walker was one of the participant teachers, and she won one of the Funding Friday awards. She was so psyched about this. So join our education group.
Thank you, Shelley. Next up, we have a contribution from Australia, from Leslie Wyborn, who's not here right now, but it was about the Epic Fails session. And Erin, would you like to say anything about this?
Sure. So I think one of the things that we hear from ESIP is that ESIP is a place where people talk about their failures in many of the breakout sessions, but this was a specific session on failures in projects. And we really, as we talked about it, there were 3, and then maybe too many more to list, but human, technology, and organizational challenges. We were really lucky that both Leslie and Kirsten Leonard were very candid in talking about their own failures, their own project failures, and failures that they had seen happen. And it seemed like with the response in the room that there was interest in continuing this conversation. And so one suggestion was to develop blogs on failure and to really celebrate failure within ESIP ongoing. There was also an idea of having a special journal issue. And I think if you're interested in that, if you want to be an editor or submit a paper there, just let me know. And then there is, I think, interest in rerunning the session again, but we would be curious in your thoughts on how to continue being a community where we talk about failure and learn from failure. I think that maybe the biggest takeaway was that failures are really only failures when we don't learn anything from them.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks. Next, we have Karen Moe, who will talk about trusted data sources for operational decision making.
Thank you, Megan. So this was sponsored by the Disasters Lifecycle Cluster, and we've been really focusing on how to get more access to federal data services, improving discovery and access for disaster applications. And we collaborate with emergency managers. In fact, I consider us to be kind of data brokers between the emergency operations personnel and Earth observing data and related GIS data that they don't know about and can use. We've been working particularly with the electric utility sector and earthquake response sector. And we discovered right away that we didn't have enough time at the ESIP meeting to do everything, so we had a pre-meeting webinar. We invited federal data agency representatives to talk to us from NASA, NOAA, USGS, and FEMA, 3 of which participated to tell us what data and services they had and how to access them. And we learned that there are portals. In the meeting talks, we had invited a couple of people locally from Washington State. We basically talked about operational readiness levels and need for special kinds of data. And our key takeaway points really were that we need to clarify the emergency operations approach to getting data. We have some trust issues with data, and we learned about how the All Hazards Consortium is using operational readiness levels. And we're going to follow up with the federal agencies about all of these different portals. Join us where we meet Thursdays at first Thursdays. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Next up, we have Mark Parsons, who will be talking about meeting the maintainers.
Yeah, hi all. Thank you, Megan. The Maintainers is a new research and advocacy network. Their tagline is maintaining self and society through reflection, research, and advocacy. And there's a subgroup of the maintainers called the Information Maintainers, with the purpose to, quote, support the maintenance of information and those who manage, maintain, and preserve information systems, like a lot of ESIPers. And so this Information Maintainers group published a paper a little while ago called Information Maintenance as a Practice of Care. And I'll actually put the link to that in the chat. And this paper was cast as a sort of as a potluck, where the 40 or so contributors brought their perspectives to describe the meaning and practice of maintenance and care, and while also requesting others to bring their perspectives, bring their dishes to the table. So in that spirit, Bruce Caron had the idea of having this session at ESIP, this maintainer session at ESIP, and he gave a really nice introduction, and then we had 4 excellent speakers: Emily Jane Silik Glassman from NASA, Daniela Lowenberg from California Digital Library, Jason Gallo from Science and Technology Policy Institute, and Fred Beach from UT Austin. And they covered really a broad array of topics, from historical data rescue to complex prediction, from building partnerships to maintaining the chaos that is the US energy infrastructure. And we had some really excellent discussion. From all of this, I think Bruce noted 3 takeaways that you see there. I'll just summarize that maintenance is broad. It requires kindness and support for relationships. Maintenance is complex and increasingly complex. And maintenance doesn't necessarily mean the status quo. Change is sometimes necessary, and sometimes it's necessary to fight pernicious status quos. And so the recordings of all of this and the slides are on Sched, and you can find the paper. And also the Maintainers is having a conference in October in DC. And you can find information on that website. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Next, we have Colin Smith, who will be talking about the Information Management Code Registry.
Hi, folks. So the Information Management Code Registry works towards a comprehensive list of open source software that is searchable by information management task and other common software attributes, with the goal to help accelerate the information management for researchers in the environmental sciences domain, as well as to facilitate development of new IAM software. In this session, we presented the beta release of the IMCR to gather feedback before moving to production. And the feedback we received and the main takeaways from this session were to constrain the scope of this resource further for user understandability, to align the IMCR vocabularies with well-established ontologies, to add metadata detail for machine actionability, and finally to mine the web for potentially useful software. I thank everyone who participated in this session and contributed to the development of this resource. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you, Colin. Next up, we'll have Rama, who will be speaking about information quality.
Yes.
the information quality, we had a 1.5-hour session where we had 5 talks. The cluster has been active since 2014 and trying to improve understanding various aspects of information quality. We talk about 4 aspects of information quality: science quality, product quality, data stewardship quality, and service quality. And all those are of concern to this cluster. And given the 5-year work that's been going on, there are reports on progress. NASA's Data Quality Working Group also has been active for 5 years, and we just retired that working group in March 2019. And so Yashing Wei gave a talk about that. And Peng talked about the NOAA's data stewardship maturity matrices and their adoption. And the picture on the right side here shows that it's taken on an international adoption of that concept. And we had Ivana Ivanova from Australia talk about OGC's Data Quality Domain Working Group. And we had a talk from David Maroney about the uncertainty white paper that we have been developing in the information quality cluster. So we have had collaborations that have developed during the last 2 years with connections established with other clusters as well as non-US and international groups, including the E2SIP in Australia. And we have had community engagement efforts to seek outside collaboration. At fall AGU sessions, we have had papers presented and we have had sessions organized. So that's been a good avenue for inviting speakers to our monthly meetings. Most of the time we have monthly telecons, and each time we have invited speakers from various places. So more information you can find at the wiki site here.
So next.
Yeah. So this one also, I'm sorry about the background noise here. If it is bothering you, I can speak later. But
fine, Rama.
Is that okay? Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so the Data Product Developers Guide Working Group in the NASA's ESDSWG has been active for about 1.5 years now. And our purpose has been to develop a guide to assist science data product developers in designing their products and making sure that the products are interoperable and conveniently usable by the community. And the purpose of this workshop session was to get the attendees to review and comment on a version that we have produced that we have referring to as version 0.3. And so we had over 25 people attend the meeting, and we got more than 80 comments from the working group session. And so approximately 30 were editorial comments, but there were a little over 50 technical comments that are helping improve that document. It's not meant only for, it's mainly meant for NASA data producers, but I think what we develop here is more broadly applicable as well. So that was the purpose for having this session at the ESIP meeting. So some of the key comments were retitling of the document, which is sort of obvious. Want to include data producers in the title, and provide upfront paragraph to tie different sections to the particular goals of particular readers. Provide guidance on facilitating user feedback on data product quality as well as usability. And there was a section 5 in the document that talked about chunking and compression, and people felt that that needed some rework. And that's about it. I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much, Rama, for those report outs. Next, we'll hear from Kristen Vanderbilt, who will talk about enabling data discovery by place.
Right. John Porter and I organized our session because we were curious to learn from the community what ways data discovery by location could be improved. So John kicked off the session with a presentation about how using gazetteers could help point data curators to standardized names for places. For geographic features names from a gazetteer to be useful, they need to be within a reasonable distance of the actual data collection location. And so as a case study, John analyzed metadata from over 170,000 research sites worldwide, as shown in the upper figure. And in the lower figure, you can see that the median distance between the coordinates for research sites and a named place from GNIS, which is a US gazetteer, is 0.4 kilometers. So this case study shows that this US-based gazetteer could be useful for assigning standardized place names to US research sites. And following John's presentation, we had a group discussion about what could be done to make it easier to discover data by location. And we learned that one major issue is that spatial data searches are often constrained by the use of a bounding box to identify an area to search. A scientist searching for data on a river, for instance, may have to search using a bounding box rather than a more linear shape, and will therefore find a lot of data that aren't what they're looking for. We also learned that some in the community would welcome a tool that would take coordinates of a research site and return the closest named place from a gazetteer. We also talked a bit about the need for best practices or recommendations for how to include place names in dataset documentation. For instance, a best practice might be to always include the county and state in metadata for data collected in the United States. For next steps, it was suggested that we take the feedback from this session to the ESIP documentation cluster to see if we might consider this topic further as part of that cluster's work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Last but not least, we are going to hear from Lewis McGivney about the various semantics activities that took place.
Thanks, Megan. We're always on Fridays for semantic technologies, and we seem to be last again today. No problem. I don't know if anybody recognised and saw that semantic technologies featured very heavily at the meeting this year. It's great to see that, and it just shows how much growth I think and interest there is in the field just now. Can hopefully continue that. We had our full-day geosemantic symposium with good attendance on the Monday, with 10 sessions all in related, including a full day on which Doug had mentioned on schema.org. And the forum for discussion there is excellent. It's a significant portion of that ESIP meeting was dedicated to the topics and the kind of projects that we're working on. Within the last year, I think just over a year, semantic technologies has witnessed the rollout of 3 clusters: Community Ontology Repository, which became a formal cluster, Science on Schema.org, or the new cluster which Doug and Adam and Chuck Vardaman are going to be kind of leading, and then semantic harmonization, which is we actually had a session on that this year, the ESIP meeting as well. Takeaways were from the Geosemantic Symposium that there's a lot of opportunity for us to align machine learning use cases with what data semantics can provide. We're working on a publication for Suite, which is going to update essentially everything that we're doing and kind of pay some attribute, or pay a lot of attribute, to the 2005 publication by Raskin and Pan. We're hoping to facilitate the Geosemantic Symposium twice a year now, and hopefully we'll be putting that together for next year's budget. To be honest with you, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on, and we're looking to be building on our strategic plan, which we put together in our business meeting as well. If you're at ESIP and you were interested in this kind of stuff, it's a good chance that you've probably already heard from parts of the community. We have a plan for reaching out to a number of clusters this next year, so we look forward to that. And I'll end it there. Megan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lewis. So I just have a couple of more slides. I would like to say that's a wrap up on the report outs, and I would like to give a shout out to our generous sponsors from the summer meeting. We can't have this webinar without acknowledging them. I also want to point out a few of the various ways you can jump in and get involved in ESIP if you're not already. Of course, you're welcome to join one of the collaborations, many of which you heard about today. There's absolutely no need to RSVP. You can look at the ESIP community calendar on our website and join anything you see there. You can consider applying for ESIP Lab small grant funding. Like Annie mentioned, you can encourage your organization to become an ESIP partner. There are 3 small actions you can take also, including joining the next Data to Action webinar, which will be in September. You can also join the Monday Update mailing list. I strongly suggest this if you're not already on it. It's the best way to know what's going on in and around ESIP. You can also check out and share this link on the bottom right to a great one-pager about ESIP. Finally, I'd like to thank you all for joining today and share a save the date for the 2020 ESIP Winter Meeting. Now just about 150 days away, the meeting will be held in Bethesda, Maryland, January 7th to the 9th. We're working hard to put together an awesome agenda. There'll be more information released shortly, including the call for sessions. That brings our webinar to a close. Thank you to our speakers and all who joined us today. This is a reminder also that this recording will be made available on the ESIP YouTube channel.
Thanks, Megan, and everybody else.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.